An elegant black woman in her late 50s sits handcuffed in the back of a police cruiser. Her designer suit is torn. Blood is running from her temple. Through the window, she watches the white cop who arrested her, laughing with his partner, making fun of her claims. Her FBI credentials are lying in the mud outside. She closes her eyes, not in defeat, in calculation. This racist cop in Millbrook County, Georgia, has no idea he just blew up his entire department. In 72 hours, federal agents will swarm this place. But first, she has to survive tonight. 20 minutes earlier, the evening had felt almost calm, despite the emotional weight on her chest. Dr. Vanessa Wright, the first African-American female FBI director in U.S. history, drove alone down a rural Georgia highway as the sun stained the sky with shades of orange and purple. She'd left her security detail behind in Washington 3 days ago, needing privacy for something very personal. Her mother was dying in a nursing home 3 hours south of Atlanta. Vanessa wanted these last visits to be private, just a daughter and her mom, without the fuss of federal agents and official rules. She drove her own car, a simple silver sedan she kept for personal trips. Nothing that screamed government or power. Just a woman visiting her dying mother, trying to hold on to the last pieces of the person who raised her to be strong, fearless, and to never take injustice lying down. The visit was heartbreaking. Her mother barely knew her today, drifting in and out of clear moments, sometimes calling her by a childhood nickname, sometimes looking at her like a total stranger. Vanessa held her hand for hours, telling her stories about her work, the cases she'd solved, about becoming the first woman to lead the FBI. In one clear moment, her mother squeezed her hand and whispered that she was proud that she had raised a fighter. Vanessa left as the sun started to set, promising she'd be back tomorrow, knowing tomorrow could be too late. Now, driving through this strange county with its empty roads and scattered farms, she let herself cry, processing the grief she couldn't show at work, couldn't let her staff see, couldn't admit to a world that watched her every move. The pickup truck came out of nowhere. It swerved hard across the center line. A rust-colored beast with a Confederate flag sticker on the back window, driven by someone either drunk or reckless, or both. Vanessa wrenched the wheel to the right, her heart pounding in her chest as she fought for control. Her sedan jumped off the pavement, tires screaming, and hit a roadside mailbox with a sick crunch of metal and wood. The truck never slowed down, never stopped. It just roared past and vanished around a curve, leaving her shaking on the side of the road. She sat for a second, breathing hard, her hands trembling on the wheel. Then, her training took over. She was fine, unhurt, just shaken up. She put the car in park, turned on her emergency lights, and got out to check the damage. The mailbox was in pieces, a casualty of a crash she hadn't meant to cause. Her front bumper was dented and the headlights were smashed, but the car seemed drivable. She took out her phone and took pictures of everything. The broken mailbox, her damaged car, the skid marks on the pavement, the direction the truck went. She even burned part of the license plate into her memory before it was gone. Georgia Tag started with RBK. She was documenting, saving evidence, doing what any cop would do. Within 5 minutes, she saw headlights coming up behind her. A sheriff's patrol car, white with a gold star on the door, pulled up slow. At first, Vanessa felt relieved. She'd report the hit and run, give a statement, swap information about the mailbox, and get going. The deputy who got out of the cruiser was young, maybe early 30s, with a military buzz cut and pale blue eyes that locked right on her face. He didn't walk over with concern. He walked over with suspicion. Deputy Travis Holcomb, his name badge, said, looked at the broken mailbox, looked at her car, looked at her face, and his whole attitude changed to something cold and hostile. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't ask what had happened. He asked, his tone full of contempt, what she was doing in this neighborhood. Vanessa kept her voice steady and professional. Years of high-stakes negotiations taught her to never make things worse if you don't have to. She told him about the pickup truck, the swerve, how she couldn't avoid hitting the mailbox. She said she had pictures, had documented the whole thing, even got a partial plate. Holcomb listened with his arms crossed, his face a mask. When she was done, he just said he didn't see another vehicle. Vanessa blinked, confused. She repeated the description. Rust-colored pickup, Confederate flag, Georgia plates starting with RBK. Holcomb circled her car slowly, checking every detail like she was the criminal, not the victim. He asked for her license and registration, his voice carrying an unspoken accusation. She got both from her car, handed them over, and told him she was a federal employee. He barely glanced at her credentials. Lots of folks claim they're important when they get caught doing something they shouldn't. The words were like a slap. Caught doing what? She was the victim here. But Holcomb was already heading back to his cruiser, talking into his radio, his posture aggressive and sure of himself. Vanessa stood by her car as the evening got colder and felt the first real flicker of worry. Something was wrong here. This deputy didn't care about the truth. He'd already made up his mind that she was guilty of something. 10 minutes later, another car showed up. Sheriff Buck Crawford got out of a pickup that looked official enough with its light bar and county seal, but it felt more personal, like he'd been pulled away from his dinner. Crawford was a big man in his 60s, his face lined from sun and cigarettes. His gray hair cut short, and his eyes sized her up with immediate disapproval. He talked with Holcomb for a minute, both of them looking over at her again and again, then walked over with the slow, deliberate stride of a man who owned this road and everyone on it. He looked at the mailbox, looked at her car, and announced she was under arrest for hit and run, reckless driving, and leaving the scene of an accident. Vanessa's shock was a physical thing, a jolt that ran through her. She protested right away, her voice rising in spite of her training. She never left. She was standing right here. She had pictures to prove it all. Crawford didn't give a damn. He saw an expensive suit on a black woman in his white county, and he already had the story written in his head. She was guilty. Nothing she said was going to change that. Vanessa made herself stay calm, speak clearly, use the authority she'd earned in 40 years of law enforcement. She gave him her full identification. Dr. Vanessa Wright, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She took her credentials out of her jacket, the official badge and ID that opened doors all over the country, that demanded respect from every level of law enforcement, that stood for the highest law enforcement authority in the nation. She held it out to Sheriff Crawford with a steady hand. He took it, looked it over with fake seriousness. And then he laughed. A cruel, mocking sound. He called it a fancy fake ID. Said he'd seen plenty of them. Said criminals were getting real good with their forgeries. Deputy Holcomb laughed too, adding he knew she was lying about being a federal agent the second she said it, because people like her always try to make themselves sound important. People like her. The word just hung there, ugly and obvious. Vanessa knew then, with total clarity, that her credentials, her job, her whole career meant nothing to these men. They only saw the color of her skin. That's all. They needed to see. She tried reasoning with them, asked them to just call the FBI field office in Atlanta, only 90 miles away. One call would clear everything up. Crawford just ignored her. When she reached for her own phone to make the call, Crawford's hand shot out and smacked it out of her hand. It hit the asphalt, and the screen spiderwebbed with cracked glass. She stared at her broken phone, shocked by how casual the violence was. She protested, her voice now shaking with a mix of anger and fear. He had just destroyed government property. He had just assaulted a federal officer. Crawford got closer, in her personal space, his breath hot on her face as he told her to shut her mouth, or he'd add resisting arrest to the list of charges. Deputy Holcomb came up behind her, grabbing her arm way too hard. She instinctively pulled back, and he yelled that she was resisting. Crawford joined in, both men closing in on her like predators. They spun her around, slammed her against her car, the metal cold through her silk shirt. Holcomb's hands searched her roughly for weapons, his touches meant to humiliate her, not keep him safe. She stated her rights, set her position again, demanded they verify who she was through proper channels. Every word vanished into their contempt. Holcomb yanked her arms behind her back with enough force to make her gasp. The handcuffs bit into her wrists. Metal teeth clamped down too tight. Painful on purpose. When she cried out, Crawford told her to shut up, or they'd add assaulting an officer. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights and shouting. All white faces, all holding up phones to record. But they weren't filming police brutality. They were cheering for it. Someone called her an entitled black woman who thinks she's better than us. Someone else yelled about criminals getting what they deserve. Another voice threw a racial slur so nasty it made her flinch. The crowd loved her arrest, watching it. Like it was a show, Crawford played for them, announcing loud and proud he'd caught another one trying to scam her way out of trouble. Holcomb added that she had fake government IDs and everything went all out. The crowd laughed and clapped. Vanessa realized with a sick feeling this was a performance, a public spectacle to reinforce whatever twisted social order they believed in. Crawford said he had to search her car for evidence. Vanessa told him he had no probable cause, no warrant. He did it anyway, digging through her car while she stood there handcuffed and helpless. He found her briefcase in the trunk, government issue, with federal seals on it. Inside were classified documents about ongoing cases, intelligence briefings she'd been reviewing. Crawford held it up like a trophy, calling it evidence, ignoring the official markings that proved exactly who she was. This was now a major national security breach, but she couldn't do a thing to stop it. They dragged her to the patrol car, and as Holcomb pushed her into the back, her head hit the door frame. Pain exploded in her skull, white-hot. Blood started to run from her temple, warm and sticky, dripping down her face onto her torn suit. Neither cop showed any concern. Crawford told the crowd she had fallen while resisting, his tone making it clear he expected them to believe his story. They nodded along, phones still recording, creating a dozen lies that would be all over the internet in a few hours. Holcomb picked her FBI credentials up from where they'd fallen and dropped them right into a muddy puddle. He ground them under his boot, destroying them just as completely as he had destroyed any chance of this ending peacefully. Vanessa watched through the cruiser window, blood in her eyes, and knew these men weren't just racists. They were systematically destroying evidence. This was deliberate, planned, a routine they had done before. She wasn't the first person they'd done this to. And if they do this to the director of the FBI, what had they done to regular people who didn't have her resources, her position? The thought was colder than her own fear. The drive to the station felt like forever. Every minute was an hour as Vanessa sat in the back, hands cuffed painfully behind her, blood drying on her face, her head pounding. Deputy Holcomb drove while Sheriff Crawford rode shotgun. They didn't bother with the radio or any professional behavior. They talked about her like she wasn't there, like she was an object, their words casual and cruel. Crawford said she was one of them uppity ones, the kind who thought a nice suit and some fake ID would get her out of anything. Holcomb agreed, guessing she probably stole that designer outfit and probably had a long criminal record they'd find when they ran her prints. They laughed about teaching her a lesson she wouldn't forget, about showing her this was their county and their rules applied to everyone, especially people who didn't belong. Vanessa tried one more time to tell them who she was, speaking slowly, clearly, despite the pain. She asked them to call the FBI in Atlanta, to call the director's office in D.C., to verify her identity through any official channel. Crawford turned around in his seat, his face a mask of contempt, and told her if she said one more word, he'd charge her with threatening a police officer. The threat was obvious. Any pushback, any protest, any demand for her rights would just mean more charges, more violence. She went quiet, saving her energy, planning her next move. They got to the Millbrook County Sheriff's Station just after 8 p.m. It was a low brick building, old and worn down, in a town that felt stuck in the past. They pulled her out of the cruiser and marched her right past the front windows for everyone to see. Deputies and staff stopped to stare. A female dispatcher whispered something to a coworker, and Vanessa heard the words, "Another one." It had happened before. They'd done this before. This station had a habit of bringing in black people, humiliating them, making an example of them. The booking process was all about stripping away her dignity. They took her fingerprints, rolling each finger across the ink and paper with too much force. They took her mugshot from different angles, the camera capturing her torn suit, her bloody face, her tired eyes. She said her name clearly for the record. Dr. Vanessa Wright, director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The booking officer, a younger deputy named Marcus Webb, paused when she said it. He was black, maybe in his late 20s, and something in his eyes showed he doubted what was happening. But Sheriff Crawford was his boss, the man who held his career in his hands in this little town. Webb said nothing. He processed her like any other suspect, typing her info into the computer with hands that moved just a little too slow, like he didn't want to do it. Vanessa asked for her phone call, the one right even the worst criminals get. Crawford said no, claiming the courthouse was closed and she could make her calls tomorrow. She knew this was illegal, a clear violation of her constitutional rights, but she was alone in a hostile place with no allies and no way to call for help. She demanded a lawyer. Crawford said lawyers didn't make house calls this late for criminals in Millbrook, and she could ask for one at her arraignment tomorrow. She asked for a doctor for her head, pointing out she might have a concussion, that she was bleeding. He just glanced at her and said it was just a scratch, told her she was fine, refused to call for medical help or even get her a bandage. The blood had dried on her face and neck, stiff and awful, a visible reminder of their cruelty. They put her in a holding cell in the back of the station, a small concrete room with metal bars, a bench on the wall, and a toilet with no seat or privacy. It was cold and filthy, and it smelled like piss and despair. They only took the handcuffs off after they locked her in. The relief of having her hands free was drowned out by the reality of where she was. Still in her torn, bloody suit, still in her heels, still without food or water. She sat on the metal bench and forced herself to think like a strategist. Her office thought she was on personal leave until Monday. It was Friday night. Nobody would even know she was missing for more than 50 hours. Her phone was smashed. Her ID was ruined. Her briefcase was gone. She had no way to contact anyone, no way to prove who she was, no leverage except her own mind and her own will. But she'd been through worse. She'd interrogated terrorists, negotiated with drug lords, faced down global threats. She would not be broken by a racist sheriff in a podunk county. Through the bars, she watched the station. Crawford and Holcomb were near the front desk, celebrating. They poured coffee, joked with other deputies, and acted out the arrest with big gestures that made everyone laugh. Crawford made a call, his voice low, and Vanessa strained to hear. She caught pieces. FBI impersonator, black woman who thought she was smart, how she'd been taken care of and won't be a problem. Those words sent a chill down her spine. Taken care of, won't be a problem. These weren't the words of cops who made a mistake. These were the words of men who knew exactly what they were doing and were sure they'd get away with it. Vanessa's blood ran cold as she saw the full danger she was in. They weren't just racist cops who arrested the wrong person. They were part of something bigger, something that let them operate without fear for years. And they were planning to make sure she never told her story. If she hadn't been the director of the FBI, if she didn't have the resources that would eventually trigger a massive search, she could just disappear. How many others had they done this to? How many people had sat in this exact cell, scared and alone, before they were erased from all records? The hours dragged by. Vanessa sat in that cold cell, her body aching, her head pounding, her mind running through every possible outcome. She hadn't eaten since lunch, hadn't had a drink of water since before the crash, and every time she asked a passing deputy for anything, they either ignored her or made fun of her. One young deputy called her princess and said she should have thought about that before she decided to be a criminal. Another just laughed and said she was getting what she deserved. The station slowly emptied as the night wore on. Deputies finished their shifts, went home to their families and warm beds. Only a skeleton crew was left, a few officers managing the overnight in a county where not much happened most nights. Vanessa used the time to watch, to memorize, to gather intel that would matter later. She noted which deputies looked uncomfortable with how she was being treated, which ones joined in, which ones wouldn't even look at her cell. She memorized the security camera locations, the shift change times, the patterns of movement. She was still the FBI director, still an expert in observation and analysis. She would remember it all. Around midnight, Deputy Marcus Webb came by her cell on his rounds. He was alone. The other night shift deputies were busy somewhere else. He stopped outside the bars and spoke quietly, his voice a near whisper. He asked if she was really the director of the FBI. Vanessa studied him, trying to figure out if he was genuinely curious or just mocking her. She saw something in his eyes that gave her a little hope, a mix of doubt and shame. She told him yes. She explained the whole story, from the hit and run to the arrest, described every illegal thing Crawford and Holcomb had done. Webb listened, his face getting more troubled with every word. He admitted Crawford had a reputation. That 3 years ago, a black businessman had told a similar story about being mistreated and having his ID ignored. The man was supposed to go to trial, but vanished before his court date. Officially, the record said he moved away, dropped the charges on his own. Webb never bought it. The man's car was found at the county line. His things were left behind. His family was hysterical. But Crawford closed the case fast, claiming the man ran to avoid trouble. No real investigation, no follow-up, no answers. Vanessa's stomach clenched. They'd done this before. They'd made someone disappear. And now they had her. She asked Webb for help, her voice urgent. "Call the Atlanta FBI office," she pleaded. "Verify who I am. One phone call will end this." Webb wanted to help. She could see it in how his hands gripped the bars, how he couldn't look her in the eye, the tension in his shoulders. But he was scared to death. Crawford ran everything in Millbrook County. The sheriff, the judges, the prosecutors, the mayor. All connected, all white, all protecting each other. Webb was the only black deputy on the force, hired years ago only because a federal lawsuit had forced the county to diversify. If he crossed Crawford, he'd lose his job. His family needed that paycheck. And there was the fear he didn't say out loud. He might lose more than his job. He could end up like that businessman, gone and forgotten. Webb promised he'd think about it, his voice shaking a little. Then he did something that shocked her. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a bottle of water, a fresh one, contraband he wasn't supposed to give her. He passed it through the bars, quickly looking around to make sure no one saw. It was the first act of real kindness Vanessa had seen since this nightmare started. She drank it slowly, making the precious water last, grateful beyond words. Around 2 a.m., Sheriff Crawford came back to the station. He was drunk, stumbling, slurring his words. He'd been at a bar celebrating his big arrest with his friends. He staggered over to her cell, leaned against the bars, and breathed whiskey fumes into the stale air. He told her she picked the wrong county to pull her scam. Said he'd seen her kind before, educated black folks who thought their degrees and their big words made them better than hardworking white people. He said his granddaddy taught him how to handle people like her, how to keep them in their place, how to keep order. The racism was raw now, out in the open, flowing freely with the booze. He got right up to the bars, his face inches from hers, and promised by Monday she'd be charged with felony impersonation of a federal officer. 10 years in prison, he said, smiling. She'd rot in a cell, just like this one, forgotten by a system that didn't care about criminals faking their way out of trouble. Vanessa said nothing. She'd learned long ago there's no point in arguing with that kind of hate. Instead, she watched him, listened, and gathered information. His speech was loose, sloppy. He mentioned names she hadn't heard before. Judge Harold Crawford, his cousin, would be handling her arraignment. Prosecutor Martin Hayes, his old deputy, loyal and trustworthy. The bail bondsman, his brother-in-law, part of the family business. It was a whole network of corruption, a web that had trapped dozens of people before her. Even if she proved who she was, Crawford thought he was untouchable in his county. He had done this before and gotten away with it every single time. As Crawford stumbled away, laughing to himself, Vanessa saw something through the station window. A security camera on a pole outside, pointed at the intersection where she was arrested. If it was recording at the time, it would have caught everything. The pickup forcing her off the road, her pulling over, her taking pictures, her never leaving the scene. It would prove she was innocent. But it was Crawford's camera, installed and run by his department. Would that footage still be there in the morning? Or was it already gone, destroyed, like her phone and her credentials? Erased from existence, like the truth he refused to see. Saturday morning came with a weak sun, filtering through the cell's small window. Vanessa hadn't slept. Her body hurt too much, and her mind was too busy to rest. Every muscle ached, and her head throbbed with every beat of her heart. She was filthy, thirsty, hungry, and very aware she had been locked up for over 12 hours without proper food, water, medical help, or a lawyer. This was torture, deliberate and systematic, meant to break her spirit before her court appearance. But she refused to break. She was the director of the FBI. She had survived 40 years in a field run by men, had fought through prejudice and doubt, and earned her job through sheer brilliance and will. She would not be beaten by a racist sheriff in some forgotten Georgia county. Around 9 a.m., they came for her, Deputy Holcomb and another officer. They didn't say a word as they cuffed her hands in front this time and led her out to a transport van. They were taking her to the courthouse for her arraignment. She was still in her torn, bloody suit, still dirty from a night in that cell, her injuries still visible. They had purposely denied her any chance to clean up, making sure she'd look like the criminal they said she was when she appeared before the judge. The courthouse was 100 years old, all dark wood and marble, with a Confederate statue standing guard out front. Inside, it was mostly empty. Saturday arraignments were rare, only for urgent cases. Apparently, she was urgent. They took her through a side door, avoiding any press or public, keeping it all quiet and controlled. They put her in a holding cell next to the courtroom and left her there for another hour, letting the anxiety build, making sure she knew how powerless she was in their world. When they finally brought her into the courtroom, she saw Judge Harold Crawford on the bench. The sheriff's cousin, just like he'd said. He was older than Buck, maybe in his 70s, with white hair and the same cold, contemptuous eyes as his relative. This wasn't going to be a fair hearing. This was theater. A young woman came up to her, whispering that she was Amy Chin, her public defender. Chin looked terrified, fresh out of law school, this being only her third case. She hadn't had time to look at anything, hadn't prepared a defense. She was walking in completely blind. Vanessa whispered urgently, "I'm the director of the FBI. Verify my identity. Call the bureau." Chin looked confused, overwhelmed, and nodded, but it was clear she didn't believe a word of it. To her, Vanessa was just another defendant with a wild story. Prosecutor Martin Hayes stood up to read the charges, his voice full of Southern charm that hit a sharp venom. Hit and run, reckless driving, leaving the scene, resisting arrest, impersonating a federal officer, assaulting a police officer. The last two were new, added since her booking, just to pile on the pressure. Hayes asked for $50,000 bail, arguing she was a flight risk because of her deceptive behavior. Judge Crawford agreed instantly, before Amy Chin could even say a word. Vanessa couldn't stay quiet any longer. Against Chin's frantic whispers, she addressed the court herself, standing as tall as her aching body would let her. She stated her full name clearly. Dr. Vanessa Wright, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. She gave her badge number, her direct office line, the number for the FBI's Atlanta office. She demanded the court verify who she was before they went any further. Judge Crawford's face turned red with anger. He told her to sit down and be quiet, that he wouldn't have disruptions in his courtroom. She kept going, her voice getting stronger. She listed her career highlights, the major cases she'd solved, the presidents she had briefed, the congressional committees she'd testified for. She told him that everything they had done to her in the last 18 hours was a federal crime. The judge slammed his gavel, threatening her with contempt of court if she said another word. She finally fell silent, but she never took her eyes off his face. He looked uneasy now, shifting in his chair, maybe wondering for the first time if she was telling the truth. But he was in too deep, too committed to his cousin's story to back down now. In the courtroom gallery sat one person who wasn't supposed to be there, a young black woman with a notebook and a press pass. Kesha Monroe from the Millbrook County Register, a small local paper. Monroe was writing furiously, her expression doubtful but focused. When the court took a short break, Monroe went up to Amy Chin, asking questions about the case, about the defendant's crazy claims, about why anyone would pretend to be the FBI director. Chin had no answers, But Vanessa caught Monroe's eye from across the room. The reporter saw something in her, a quality of dignity and command that didn't fit the charges. Monroe's reporter instincts kicked in. She smelled a story. Unable to make the $50,000 bail, Vanessa was sent back to custody. Back in the van, back to the station, back to that cold, filthy cell. But something was different. Deputy Marcus Webb was on duty when she got back, and he came to her cell as soon as the other deputies were gone. He told her he'd made up his mind last night. He was going to help her, but he had to be smart about it. If Crawford found out before they had proof, both of them could be in real danger. Webb had a plan. He had a friend at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, a real investigative journalist with sources and a reputation. Webb would send Vanessa's information to this reporter and let them verify her identity on their own. Once a major newspaper confirmed who she was, Crawford couldn't hide it. The story would blow up. But it would take time, maybe 24 hours, maybe more. Could she hold on? Vanessa agreed right away. 24 hours was nothing. But then Webb told her something that changed the whole game. The night before, after Crawford left drunk, Webb had checked the security footage from the camera at the intersection. The footage showed exactly what she'd said. A pickup swerving in her lane, forcing her off the road, her car hitting the mailbox because she had no choice, her getting out and taking pictures. Clear, undeniable proof of her innocence. Webb had planned to save a copy. But when he went back to the evidence room this morning to get it, the footage was gone. The whole evening had been deleted from the system, wiped clean like it never happened. Crawford had erased it. This wasn't just racial profiling anymore. This wasn't just a bad arrest. This was evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, a conspiracy to violate her civil rights. These were serious federal crimes, and Crawford had committed them on purpose to hide his racism and protect his corrupt little kingdom. And that meant Crawford was willing to do anything to keep Vanessa quiet. She realized with a chilling certainty that she was in far more danger than she'd thought. If Crawford would destroy evidence, if he would commit federal felonies to protect himself, what else would he do? How far would he go to make sure she never told anyone what happened in his county? Sunday morning brought no comfort. Vanessa had now been locked up for over 36 hours, and the physical toll was getting bad. She was dehydrated, exhausted, her untreated injuries throbbed, and her mind was worn out from the nonstop stress. But she refused to show any weakness. Every time a deputy walked past her cell, she sat up straight, looked them in the eye, and projected the authority she had spent a lifetime building. She was not a victim. She was a federal officer, wrongfully held, and she would get through this. Sheriff Crawford visited her again late Sunday morning. He was sober this time, but just as nasty. He was smug, almost happy, as he told her that the video from her arraignment had been sealed by court order. His cousin the judge had ruled that releasing it would prejudice a potential jury, so all record of her court appearance was now locked away. Crawford was systematically cutting off every path to the truth, covering his tracks. He told her that tomorrow, Monday morning, she would be moved from the sheriff's station to the county jail to wait for her trial. County jail was different, he explained with a grin. Tougher inmates, not as many guards, more chances for accidents to happen. His meaning was unmistakable. If she didn't take a plea deal, if she kept insisting she was someone important, she would be put in a dangerous place where anything could happen and no one would be to blame. He suggested she plead guilty. He'd personally recommend a light sentence, just 2 years, and she could be out in 18 months. Otherwise, she was looking at trial on 8 felonies and maybe 10 years in prison. The choice, he said, was hers. But his eyes said something else. He didn't think she'd live long enough to make that choice. Vanessa looked at him calmly and spoke with the full authority of her office. She told him that every single thing he had done over the past 2 days was a federal felony. False imprisonment, civil rights violations, tampering with evidence, obstruction of justice, conspiracy. When her office found her, they would find her, he would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. There would be no deals, no leniency, no mercy. Crawford's face turned a deep red. He slammed his fist against the bars so hard they rattled, yelling that she was crazy, that no one was coming for her, that she was just another criminal who got caught and couldn't face it. Other deputies ran over, alarmed by his outburst, and he stormed off, still yelling about uppity blacks who needed to learn their place. After Crawford was gone, Webb came back with an update. His reporter friend had given Vanessa's information to the investigative team at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. They were trying to verify who she was, but they'd hit a wall. When the paper called the FBI's Public Affairs Office about Director Wright, they got the standard reply. Director Wright is on personal leave and cannot be reached. It was normal security protocol, meant to protect her privacy. But it meant the newspaper couldn't get official confirmation without the FBI's direct help. And the FBI wouldn't help while she was supposedly on vacation. They were stuck. Webb and Vanessa knew they needed a different plan, something that would force an official response. Meanwhile, outside of Millbrook County, something was happening. The reporter, Kesha Monroe, couldn't shake her feeling that something was wrong with the case. Vanessa's confidence, her precise language, her detailed knowledge of federal law, it just didn't seem like an impersonation. Monroe started digging into Sheriff Crawford's past, going through old records and news clippings. What she found was a disturbing pattern going back 5 years. Black people arrested in Millbrook County on shaky charges. Most pleaded guilty to lesser crimes and got out of the county fast. 2 had just disappeared, their cases closed with almost no investigation. No one had ever connected the dots. Monroe decided to find the other victims, to interview anyone who would talk. She found Harold Thompson, the businessman Webb had mentioned, living in Atlanta under a new name. Thompson was scared at first, still terrified of what Crawford could do. But Monroe was persistent, and eventually, Thompson's anger won out over his fear. He told her his story. Arrested on a business trip, held for 4 days, beaten in his cell, charged with resisting arrest and assault when he was the one who'd been attacked. The charges were a joke, but Crawford had the entire local government in his pocket. Thompson pleaded guilty just to get out and fled the county, swearing he'd never go back. He lost his business, his reputation, and thousands of dollars. His life was permanently scarred by 4 days in Crawford's jail. Monroe asked if he'd go on the record. Thompson paused, then agreed. He wanted justice, even if it was years late. Webb found something else that made his blood run cold. He got into old evidence logs. Over the past 10 years, Crawford had seized hundreds of items from black suspects. Phones, laptops, jewelry, cash, even cars. Almost none of it was ever returned, even when charges were dropped. It just vanished from the evidence room. Webb found Vanessa's briefcase there, with the federal seals Crawford had ignored. Webb took a picture of it and sent it to Monroe's secure email. This physical proof, plus Thompson's story, was enough for the newspaper to run a preliminary article, even without the FBI's official word. Sunday evening, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution published its story online, pattern of racial profiling alleged against Millbrook County Sheriff. It was carefully written to avoid a lawsuit, but raised serious questions. It mentioned Vanessa only as a woman claiming to be a high-ranking federal official, and noted she was being held on charges that civil rights lawyers called highly unusual. The story included Thompson's detailed account of his arrest. It showed the picture of the federal briefcase in Crawford's evidence room. It laid out the pattern of black drivers being arrested, their property taken, and charges filed that seemed designed to intimidate, not to serve justice. Within hours, the story was all over regional news in Georgia. By midnight, it was trending on social media. Civil rights groups started sharing it. Legal experts began to comment. And in Washington, D.C., FBI Deputy Director James Chin was scrolling through the news before bed when he saw the picture of that briefcase. He knew it instantly. He had given it to Vanessa himself 3 years ago, a gift for her promotion to director. It had a small scratch on the corner from when she'd dropped it in his office, a unique mark he'd never forget. His heart stopped. If Vanessa's briefcase was in a Georgia sheriff's evidence room, and she was supposed to be visiting her mother, something was terribly, terribly wrong. He grabbed his phone and started making calls. In 30 minutes, the FBI's emergency response team was activated. Within an hour, agents were on the move. The wheels of federal justice, slow to start but impossible to stop, began to turn. And in her cell in Millbrook County, Vanessa Wright had no idea that help was already on the way. Monday morning was chaos. Vanessa woke up to the sound of phones ringing off the hook all over the station. Deputies were running around, their voices loud with confusion and alarm. Something big was happening. Crawford showed up early, his face red and furious, slamming doors and yelling at his staff. He looked worried for the first time. At 8:30 a.m., the sound of cars pulling up outside made every deputy run to the windows. Vanessa stood at her cell bars, trying to see. Then she heard it, car doors slamming, one after another. The distinct sound of federal agents moving with purpose. Her heart soared with hope. They had found her. A convoy of black SUVs with government plates had surrounded the station. 20 FBI agents got out, some in tactical gear, some in suits, led by Deputy Director James Chin himself. Chin was a good man, a sharp investigator she had mentored, someone she trusted with her life. He looked absolutely furious as he walked toward the station door with his team. They had federal warrants. One for Vanessa's immediate release and the seizure of all evidence. Another for the arrest of Sheriff Buck Crawford and Deputy Travis Holcomb on multiple federal civil rights violations. The list of charges was long. Deprivation of rights, false imprisonment, assault, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation. Together, they were facing up to 70 years in federal prison. Crawford saw what was happening too late. He tried to run for his office, probably to delete more files or get out the back, but agents cut him off. When he tried to push past them, they tackled him to the ground and cuffed him with the same rough force he had used on Vanessa. He was screaming about jurisdiction, about his rights, about how he was a sheriff here, and they had no authority. Deputy Director Chin looked down at him with cold disgust and said 4 words that shut him up for good. "You imprisoned our director." Crawford's face went pale as he finally understood the scale of his mistake. The woman he had beaten, mocked, and threatened for 3 days was exactly who she said she was. He had arrested the director of the FBI, destroyed her credentials, stolen classified documents, erased evidence, and committed a dozen federal felonies. His entire life was over. Agents brought Vanessa out of her cell. She was a wreck, injured, exhausted, her suit ruined and stiff with dried blood. But when she saw Chin and her team, she stood taller, pulling together the dignity that 72 hours of abuse couldn't destroy. Chin looked at the state she was in, and his face got dark with a barely controlled rage. He asked quietly if she was okay. She nodded, then told him she wanted to make a formal statement right now, before anything else, while every detail was still fresh. They took her to the station's conference room and set up recording gear. For the next 2 hours, Vanessa gave the most detailed statement of her life, describing every moment of her arrest, every act of violence, every threat, every right they had violated. She named names, gave times, and laid out the systematic corruption of Crawford's department. She explained about the deleted video, the smashed phone, the ruined ID, the classified briefcase. She detailed Crawford's drunken confession about his network, his cousin the judge, his ex-deputy the prosecutor, his brother-in-law the bail bondsman. She described the victim who had disappeared, the pattern of targeting black drivers, the culture of racism that infected the whole department. Her statement would be the cornerstone of the federal case, a complete account of civil rights abuses that would change law enforcement across several states. The other deputies watched, a mix of shock and fear on their faces. Some knew they were complicit, that their silence made them guilty too. Others, like Webb, felt a wave of relief that the truth was finally out. Webb went to Deputy Director Chin and explained everything he'd done to help, contacting the reporter, taking pictures of the evidence, trying to save the security footage. Chin thanked him personally, promised his career would be safe, and suggested that once the department was rebuilt under federal supervision, Webb would likely be in a leadership role. The county needed good cops, and Webb had proven he was one. Deputy Holcomb, seeing Crawford in cuffs, tried to say he was just following orders, that he couldn't say no to the sheriff. The federal agents didn't even listen. Following orders wasn't a defense for violating civil rights, and the courts had decided that a long time ago. Both men were taken into custody, put in separate cars, and driven to federal facilities to wait for their arraignment. From a station, Vanessa was taken straight to a hospital in Atlanta. Doctors treated her concussion, cleaned her cuts, and got her fluids for dehydration. They documented every single injury, taking careful pictures of bruises and wounds that would be used as evidence. While she was being treated, Vanessa made 2 calls. First, to her mother's nursing home. Her heart broke when they told her that her mother had passed away that morning. She had slipped away peacefully with nurses at her side. Vanessa had missed it. She'd missed saying goodbye because Crawford had stolen those last hours from her. She cried quietly, the tears finally coming after 3 days of holding them back, mourning her mother and the last moments they should have had. She would never forgive Crawford for that. Her second call was to the U.S. Attorney General. She wanted a full federal prosecution. No plea deals. Crawford and Holcomb would face every single charge, stand trial for every crime. They would get no mercy from the justice system they had twisted and abused. The Attorney General agreed immediately, promising the full power of the Justice Department. By noon on Monday, it was the biggest story in the country. FBI director falsely arrested by racist sheriff was in every headline. Her mugshot, showing her torn suit and bloody face, was everywhere. The images were shocking, a powerful picture of systemic racism in the police. Public outrage exploded. Civil rights groups demanded investigations into police misconduct across the South. Politicians from both parties condemned what Crawford had done. The governor of Georgia held a press conference, promising the state would cooperate fully and suggesting Millbrook County's government might need to be put under outside control. Crawford and Holcomb were arraigned in federal court that afternoon. The judge denied them bail, calling them flight risks and a danger to the community. The charges were read out loud. Multiple counts of deprivation of rights, false imprisonment, aggravated assault, evidence tampering, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and conspiracy. Their lawyers tried to argue they didn't know who Vanessa was, so they couldn't have meant to harm a federal official. The prosecution's answer was crushing. It didn't matter. Even if Vanessa had been a regular citizen, everything Crawford and Holcomb did was still a crime. They had violated the fundamental rights that belong to everyone, not just the powerful. As federal investigators dug into the Millbrook County Sheriff's Department, they found horrors that were worse than anyone imagined. Crawford wasn't just a racist cop. He'd been running a criminal enterprise for over a decade. Working with his corrupt local network, he had targeted black drivers passing through Millbrook, arrested them on fake charges, seized their property in cash, and bullied them into plea deals, keeping everything he took. Evidence logs showed over 200 cases where seized property worth more than $2 million had just vanished. This wasn't just discrimination. It was organized crime, hiding behind a badge, using racism as a tool and a motive. And those victims who had disappeared, investigators found evidence of something much darker. Bank records, phone logs, and witness statements pointed to threats and violence that went way beyond intimidation. The FBI opened multiple new investigations, racketeering, and maybe even murder. Millbrook County was about to become a poster child for everything wrong with American policing. 2 weeks after her arrest, Vanessa went back to Washington. She had recovered physically, but the experience had changed her. The scars had faded, but the psychological wounds were deep. She'd always understood, intellectually, that racism was a huge problem in America. But she had never felt that kind of raw, violent hate aimed right at her. Now she understood in her bones what millions of Black Americans faced every day. The knowledge that their rights, their dignity, their lives could be snatched away by prejudiced officials who never faced consequences. She gave dozens of interviews, went on news shows, and testified before Congress about police reform. She became a symbol for everyone who had been abused by law enforcement but didn't have the voice or the resources to fight back. She used her position to push for real change: new federal rules for police conduct, mandatory body cameras, independent review boards with real power, and federal oversight for departments with a history of civil rights abuses. Her own near destruction fueled a movement. The victims of Crawford's reign of terror started coming forward. Harold Thompson, the businessman who was beaten 3 years earlier, organized other survivors into a class-action lawsuit against the county. The stories they told were heartbreaking. A middle school teacher arrested for suspicious parking, held for a week in that same cell, beaten when she complained, and lost her job because she missed work. A military veteran pulled over for matching a description, held without charges, and assaulted so badly he needed facial reconstruction surgery, then threatened into confessing to crimes he didn't commit. A 17-year-old boy stopped for changing lanes wrong, scared into admitting he had drugs when he had none, and stuck with a felony record that ruined his chances for college. Families torn apart, careers destroyed, lives wrecked, all because they were black in Crawford County. Each story made the federal case stronger and the public outrage louder. Journalist Kesha Monroe's investigation turned into a prize-winning series that exposed Crawford's entire criminal network. Her reporting was brilliant and devastating. She tracked the money, interviewed dozens of victims, and got leaked documents that proved the department had deliberately targeted minorities. Her work won her a Pulitzer Prize. In her speech, she thanked Deputy Webb for his courage and Vanessa for her resilience. She dedicated the award to the victims who didn't live to see justice. Deputy Marcus Webb got his own recognition. After a federal review, he was promoted to interim sheriff while the county rebuilt its police force under Justice Department supervision. The FBI brought in experts to train new deputies and change the department's culture from one of racism to one of service. Webb was young for the job, only 29, but he had proven his integrity when it mattered most. For the first time, the black residents of Millbrook County began to trust the police. Webb was a symbol of change, proof that one good person could make a difference. The federal trials started 6 months after Vanessa's arrest. Crawford and Holcomb were tried separately. The prosecution laid out a mountain of evidence. Vanessa testified, describing her 72-hour nightmare with cold precision. Webb testified about the deleted evidence and the culture of fear that let Crawford operate for so long. Dozens of other victims told their stories, painting a picture of systematic abuse that spanned more than a decade. FBI experts even showed how they'd recovered the deleted security footage from a backup server Crawford didn't know about, proving Vanessa was the victim of the hit and run, not the cause. The evidence was so overwhelming that Crawford's lawyers could barely put up a fight. They tried to paint him as an old-fashioned cop who just made some bad judgments, not a criminal. The prosecution tore that defense apart, showing how deliberate his actions were. Deputy Holcomb, facing the same evidence, finally took a plea deal. In exchange for a shorter sentence, he testified against other corrupt officials in Crawford's network, exposing the full conspiracy. After 3 weeks, the jury in Crawford's trial found him guilty on all 42 counts. The courtroom was filled with his victims and their families. When the verdict was read, people cried with relief. Judge Maria Santos, a Latina federal judge known for her commitment to civil rights, handled the sentencing. She let every victim who wanted to speak tell their story in court. Vanessa spoke about the terror of being helpless in that cell, the realization that her title meant nothing to men blinded by hate. She spoke for everyone who had been silenced. When she finished, the courtroom was totally silent. Judge Santos handed down sentences that matched the crimes. Crawford got 45 years in federal prison, with no chance of parole. He was 63. He would die there. Holcomb got 25 years. He might get out one day, but only as an old man. Justice had been slow, but it had finally arrived. The convictions set off a chain reaction. The Department of Justice opened investigations into 15 other sheriff's departments in the South with similar patterns of abuse. Federal oversight increased. New rules were put in place. It wasn't perfect, but it was real progress, built on the foundation of what happened to Vanessa. Vanessa made police accountability her top priority for the rest of her time as FBI director. She created a new division just to investigate civil rights violations by law enforcement. She knew from her own experience how dangerous police misconduct could be, and she was determined to make a lasting change. Her mother had died that Monday morning while Vanessa sat in a jail cell, unable to say goodbye. She visited her mother's grave often, talking to her about the work she was doing, the justice she was fighting for. Her mother had taught her to fight back. She hadn't let her down. 6 months after Crawford's conviction, Vanessa got an anonymous letter. Plain envelope, no return address, postmarked from rural Georgia. Inside was a handwritten page from someone who just signed it, a retired FBI agent. He wrote that Crawford's father had also been sheriff of Millbrook County years ago and was just as racist and brutal. In 1994, a young black FBI agent investigating civil rights abuses in the county disappeared. The case went cold. Local cops said he just left town. Crawford's father retired soon after, untouched. His son took over and continued the family business of racist violence. The cycle had gone on for 30 years. The letter included GPS coordinates for a spot in the woods outside Millbrook. Vanessa sent a forensic team right away. They started digging in. A remote area. What they found took her breath away. 3 bodies in shallow graves. Dental records and DNA eventually identified them. One was the missing FBI agent for 1994. Another was one of Crawford's victims from 8 years ago, a man who supposedly just left town. The third was another person who disappeared while facing charges in Millbrook. Crawford was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. Even in federal prison, he'd never see the light of day again. But Vanessa realized something that chilled her to the bone. If she hadn't been the director of the FBI, if she hadn't had the power that triggered a search, she might have been the 4th body in those woods. The system didn't save her. Her title did. And that was the problem she would spend the rest of her life trying to fix. Justice shouldn't depend on who you are. It should be for everyone. That was the lesson she learned in those 72 hours of hell. And that became her mission. 5 years later, Vanessa Wright stood at a podium in Millbrook County. The town was almost unrecognizable. The crowd in the town square was diverse, black and white, standing together. They were dedicating a new civil rights memorial. Where the Confederate statue used to stand, there was now a new sculpture, bronze hands of different skin colors reaching up toward a set of balanced justice scales. The names of Crawford's victims were carved into granite walls. 23 names they had confirmed, though everyone knew there were more. 3 of those names belonged to the people found in the woods. Vanessa spoke about how Millbrook had become a symbol of what's possible when a community faces its own ugliness and commits to change. She was retiring from the FBI next month. It was time for a new chapter. Sheriff Marcus Webb joined her on stage, now 34 and a respected leader. He spoke about the department they had built, a place where citizens weren't afraid of the police. He said Vanessa's courage made it all possible. If she hadn't survived and fought back, nothing would have changed. In the crowd were people whose lives had been changed by that weekend. Harold Thompson was there with his family, his business rebuilt. He now ran a nonprofit helping the wrongfully convicted. Kesha Monroe was there, her Pulitzer Prize having launched her career. She was writing a book about racism in American policing. Amy Chin, the scare public defender, now worked for the ACLU, fighting police misconduct cases. After the ceremony, an elderly white woman came up to Vanessa. She introduced herself as Margaret Sullivan, the owner of the mailbox that was hit 5 years ago. She said Crawford had told her she didn't need to testify. She had stayed quiet while an innocent woman was brutalized right outside her house. She'd seen the arrest, heard the slurs, and did nothing. She'd lived with the guilt ever since. She apologized, her voice shaking with tears. Vanessa listened. Then she said, "Your silence hurt. It allowed evil to go on. But you're here today, facing what you did. That's the start of making it right. Change needs courage from everyone, not just the victims. It needs white people to stand up against racism, even when it's hard." As Vanessa was getting ready to leave, a young black girl came up to her. She looked about 10, and she wanted Vanessa to sign a book. The girl's name was Jasmine, and she wanted to be the FBI director someday. Vanessa smiled, but then Jasmine said something that stopped her cold. "My teacher says you were lucky because you had power," Jasmine said. "But what about my mom? She got arrested here before you came. She lost her job. She couldn't fight back like you." Vanessa felt a pang in her chest. She asked for the mother's name. Nicole Porter. Vanessa remembered the case. A middle school teacher arrested 6 years ago on fake charges. She pleaded guilty to avoid something worse and lost her teaching license. Another of Crawford's victims, destroyed by the same system. But she didn't have the power to fight back. Vanessa found Nicole in the crowd. Nicole confirmed the story. She'd been arrested, held in that same filthy cell, and forced into a plea deal that ruined her career. She never got justice because she wasn't the director of the FBI. She was just another black woman Crawford could crush. Vanessa listened, her anger and sadness growing. Her story ended in victory, but only because of her position. Nicole's ended in ruin for the exact same treatment. The system hadn't protected either of them. Power had protected Vanessa. The lack of it had doomed Nicole. Right then, Vanessa made a decision. She would use her retirement to start a foundation. The Right Justice Foundation would provide lawyers and money for victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford to fight back. It would give a voice to the voiceless. She told Nicole she would personally help her get her teaching license back, help her rebuild the career Crawford stole. She promised that Jasmine would see her mother get justice, would learn that fighting back was possible for everyone. As Vanessa drove away from Millbrook for the last time, her thoughts were heavy. Crawford was in prison for life. His network was gone. Reforms had been made. But the deeper truth was sharp and clear. Her race had almost gotten her killed, despite all her power. Imagine those with no power at all. The system hadn't protected her. Her title had. And until the system protected everyone, the fight was a long way from over. She had spent 40 years in law enforcement. Now she would spend the rest of her life demanding that it serve all people with equal justice. The last image that stayed with her was Jasmine, holding the book Vanessa had signed. Inside, she had written a message. Power isn't in titles. It's in refusing to be silent. Keep fighting. Keep demanding justice. Keep believing change is possible, because you are the future, and the future can be different. That girl would grow up in a transformed Millbrook County. She would see her mother's life restored, and she would learn that fighting injustice wasn't just possible, it was necessary. In a place once filled with hate, hope was growing. Not because the past was forgotten, but because someone powerful enough to fight back had chosen to fight for everyone. That choice, that solidarity, that was where real change began. The memorial would stand for generations, a reminder of what had happened there. But it would also be a reminder of the transformation that followed. That was Vanessa's legacy, more important than any case she had ever solved. She had survived 72 hours in hell and used it to make the world a little more, just, not perfect, never perfect, but better. And sometimes better is enough to build on. Have you ever witnessed or experienced a moment where you realize the system doesn't protect everyone equally? What changes do you think are most necessary to ensure justice applies to all people, not just those with power and resources? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations matter and your voice adds to the movement for real reform. If this story moved you or made you think differently about police accountability and civil rights, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about justice, resilience, and the ongoing fight for equality. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who works in law enforcement. Someone who has experienced injustice. Someone who believes change is possible. Together, we amplify these important stories and keep pushing for a world where everyone receives equal protection under law. Thank you for watching, for listening, for caring enough to make it to the end of this story. May we all find the courage to fight back against injustice, to stand up for those without power, and to never accept that cruelty and discrimination are inevitable. Justice is possible. Change is possible. But only if we refuse to be silent.